All right, I have greetings that I am actually going to read at the beginning of the next session because we are moving a little bit longer for the start. What I would like to do now is introduce the first moderator who will then speak to the first panel. Dr. Michael Blakey, who was perhaps best known as the lead researcher on the New York African Burial Ground, as an anthropologist and the founding director of the Institute for Historical Biology at the College of William and Mary. I welcome you to the stage and to the first session.
Well, good morning. I want to thank Dr. Kimball for hosting us, and Anna Edwards, Phil Wilato, and the rest of the Sacred Ground Project and their sponsors for creating this wonderful opportunity for us all. So I have the privilege of introducing the first panel, comprised now of, there are four of us. Autumn Rain could not, as Anna said, join us. But some of her ideas will be included. Douglas Egerton will join us via Zoom. Oh, he's here? Oh, he's I guess that must be what Zoom means. I don't know. I wasn't sure. He is professor of history at Le Moyne College and author of 8 books on leaders of rebellions, of the enslaved, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. Pamela Bingham is a descendant of Gabriel and leader of Bingham Consulting Services as a family historian, environmental engineer, and activist. Do I need to make an announcement? I hope it's implied. And Elvatrice Belsches is a Richmond public historian, author of the documentary The Life and Time of Elizabeth Keckley, and I'm Michael Blakey. I think what I've been seeing in my work is a new movement on an old theme that blends human dignity and memory, compelling things for us as human beings, of which this gathering is part. The cemetery is that oldest of human institutions of memory. And African Americans are increasingly engaged in a struggle to wrest theirs back, to restore these under their stewardship. I have begun to enjoy talking about cemeteries in terms of one of the aspects of my work as a biological anthropologist in terms of human evolution. And the burial of the dead, funerary rites, cemeteries actually represent the first evidence of human symbolism that can be found archaeologically as material. I know I have colleagues who argue about science versus religion, who should control the remains of the dead. But cemeteries, maybe they represent religion, surely they represent religion. All religions and none. I, as an agnostic, hope to be buried with some rites. They represent a human trait, like language, the use of fire, standing on 2 legs, food sharing, tools. In fact, the first modern, really archaic Homo sapiens trait in that lineage of ours is the burial of the dead, which we all do as human beings. We find it compelling, some sort of funerary ritual that marks the memory and the dignity all at the same time. So I've been calling us not Homo sapiens, sometimes, man the wise, but Homo reminiscens, the memorial maker. And they mark our landscape those little stones and the big ones. No other animal does this, and we all do it. It is about being human. And for African Americans, both the dignity and the history have been contested, have been hidden, have required us to fight to restore a history that, one way I see it in terms of the things we learned on the Remembering Slavery, Resistance, and Freedom project that Autumn Barrett and I directed, is that throughout the memorialization and telling of history at plantation sites and other areas in Virginia, there seems to be a dilemma that the telling of a truly human history for African Americans enslaved, brutalized, as a true history contradicts the mythical history of white valorization of people who did no wrong, almost could do no wrong, as these founding fathers who were slaveholders, who ran brutal camps, called them farms or plantations. So to make them into something unimaginably pure and their descendants unaccountable, then the enslaved have to look like they were in agreement with slavery. They were servants. They benefited in some way from it. And so the people we talked to working around the celebration of the sesquicentennial of the Emancipation Proclamation, celebrating, we asked them how they would like to memorialize the dead of that moment, so that one thing of importance to them was resistance, because that is what's written out of so much of the history. Because once you start to discuss resistance, then the question emerges, resistance to what? And it is to that great brutality of slaveholding and slaveholders. Thomas Jefferson describes it in The Children of Whites, describes them as uncivilized by virtue of their enslavement, of watching their parents' behavior towards others. And he says, so they will do this towards the little slaves. Uncivilized, basically, is what he says. So, resistance is that which made the enslaved human beings. They were not cattle. They did not go along. And as we looked for resistance, we found it in every corner. In daily activity and rebellion, poisonings and works slowdowns, and yes, and I think sometimes just in the way, I think of it even continuing as the way black men walk. Because somebody told you something, treated you without dignity, and you turn and you strut. That's all I have to say. And they would say it. Sterling Stuckey said they freed themselves just basically because of what they were. They were human beings. But you write out that humanity, you have to write out that humanity in order to show slaveholding and the founding of this nation as something that white people did morally for valorous purposes. So now so that is the struggle we have. And I would say can't white people tolerate any flaws? It's not the struggle over two human groups or three or more in conflict. It is the struggle for whites to be shown as having no flaws and therefore no accountability for what these others created, the wealth of the Western world, that they still inequitably control. But the point is also not only to understand, as Anna Edwards said, the who we were, who we imagine or think we should be, but it's also an understanding of how we got to where we are, that for which we are struggling, and in this same sense, to reaffirm African American dignity. And so we found that in New York, around the African burial ground, a struggle for a 18th century cemetery that was, despite all efforts against, made into a national monument, not a plaque on the wall, that from which we derived in collaboration with the community, descended community, what now stands, and you can go on the National Park Service site and read our 2009 volumes, 2,500 pages, the most sophisticated bioarchaeological project yet, a study yet conducted. Read it for yourself, get around the rumors, and that's what people did together to make that work. And what I have seen has been since then, though the impulse, as I said, is very old, the restoration of the African burial ground of Richmond, led by Anna Edwards and Phil Wilato and a whole large community. Recently, the East Marshall Street well remains that were, the press covered, were returned from the Smithsonian, that involved a large family council along the model of the African burial grounds descended community. An indignity exposed by Sean Utsi at VCU and still embraced by VCU now as in supporting its memorialization. There are sites that my institute has worked with and continues to work with in Northern Virginia, in Bethesda, Maryland, where they are still struggling to get hold. In Northern Virginia, they have now ownership of the site of this cemetery at Belmont. Louisiana, there's a struggle being carried on by one of the African burial ground leadership and others at St. Helena's Island, and I don't mean the one in South Carolina, the one off the coast of Africa where people were brought freed from slave ships after the ending of the legal transatlantic trade. There too a struggle. And Rio de Janeiro's Cemiterio dos Pretos Novos that Autumn Barrett Rain studied and compared with Richmond. And finally, I can say that, and there's the Slave Wrecks Project of the National Museum of African American History and Culture that is using our model from the African burial ground as they go to South Africa and Mozambique and Cuba. And the idea is that those descendant communities have the right to determine how memorialization will take place, because it is a family that determines, it's good to have the congregation and the neighbors come to the funeral, but it is the family that buries their dead. That is where the dignity lies. And given the struggle over the truth, it has become very important that African Americans have a key deciding role in the interpretation of the evidence of their history. All of this is moving. And I think I had finally the opportunity I gave an important lecture, they say, at Uppsala in Sweden this year, and I'll give one at a big archaeology lecture in Australia next year, that human beings have empathy with this matter. In the US, there's much that strikes against our ability, the ability of whites to empathize with blacks, the ability of, in a capitalist society, to empathize with human needs. But human beings, at considerable distance, understand what this means, because it is. a very human trait and something that's important to us all. Well, we have a number of important conversations that will be begun by our contributors, and we'll begin with Douglas Egerton, and then we'll have an open conversation with those presenters.
All right. Well, good morning, all, and I'm sorry I couldn't be here for this important event. I'm up here in snowy Syracuse, grading term papers. Sorry also about the video issues. I just have a few random thoughts, and then I look forward to joining the larger conversation. You know, we're all reading stories today about how Confederate monuments are coming down, Confederate flags are coming down all across the South, and that, of course, is a positive development. And it's easy to see now that most Americans understand the Confederacy was about the protection and expansion of slavery. It was not a question of heritage and history. But in some ways, you know, bringing down Confederate monuments is the easy part. The hard part is learning how to quickly remember and understand what the historian Jim Horton once called the tough stuff of history. The tough stuff of history are things like slave trading in Virginia, selling African Americans outside the state, and how we remember that. Not so much memorialize it, but remember it, understand it, think about it. In the antebellum period, Virginia was known as an export state because it routinely sold slaves to the fresh lands of the lower South. One thing that most of my students have been taught in high school is that in the larger Atlantic slave trade, about 400,000 Africans were sold into what is now the United States. What students, though, are typically not told is that probably twice that number, probably around 1 million African Americans were sold, resold, sold yet again over the course of their lives, most of them, again, moving to the lower South. If one was between the ages of 13 and 30, and you lived in the Chesapeake area, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, you had about a 1 in 3 chance of being sold to New Orleans and then resold again to Alabama, Mississippi, West Texas. You know, and how we remember that, and what role places like Shockoe Bottom play in that is that's the tough part. So, you know, kind of pulling down statues is one thing, but really thinking deeply and remembering the really sad, tragic parts of the American past. That's harder to do. I've noticed it's not just a question of putting statues up to replace the statue of you know, Robert Lee, the statue taken down of Lee recently in Texas, a place that Lee, by the way, actually never went to in his life. But complicating matters is the question of violence. I was involved in a small way in putting up the statue to Denmark Vesey in Charleston. They finally did get it up. They only got the part of the proposed monument up, and then of course it was vandalized quite recently. There are markers now around Richmond to Gabriel and Gabriel's conspiracy of 1800. But in some ways, you know, putting a statue to Arthur Ashe, you know, is a lot easier because he's not a, you know, violent person. When I was talking one time in Charleston about Denmark Vesey, and a person in the audience said, "Well, why didn't he just lead a protest march? Why did he have to engage in a violent conspiracy?" And I said, "Well, you know, you show me a man in 1822 in Charleston wants to lead a protest march. I'll show you a man hanging from a tree branch." But you know, we live in a world of violence and you know, handgun deaths and you know, yesterday, in fact, in the U.S. And so how we deal with somebody who is willing to use violence to accomplish black freedom is kind of tough to do. And there's, of course, the obvious double standard. Richmond is filled with statues to white Confederates who fought to keep slavery protected and expanded into the West. But when I was writing about Gabriel and writing about Denmark Vesey, and their their willingness to use violence, that is a tough topic to deal with. The way I like to think about someone like Gabriel is you need to remember that the revolution, American Revolution, was not an event; it was a process. And that white Virginian, Thomas Jefferson, famously said that this was a new kind of country based upon the principles of self-determination. All people had certain natural rights. Power flowed up from the people, not down from a king. And then, of course, America probably didn't practice what it preached. And on the day that Jefferson wrote those words, he owned slaves. 1 in 5 Americans at that point were enslaved. And so you had people who did use violence. Daniel Shays and his band, or the Whiskey Rebels in Pennsylvania in the 1790s. We fought to make America practice what it preached, and ultimately that's what Gabriel and his men were trying to do, and they died for that. Gabriel was still a young man and skilled, literate. He understood what America was supposed to be about, and he understood what America was then not about, and he gave his life to make America not just talk about liberty on the 4th of July, but actually practice that every day. And for me, that makes Gabriel's story that most American of stories. And that's really all I have to say, and I look forward to being part of the larger conversation.
Thank you very much. Our next presenter is Pamela Bingham. Well, perhaps she hasn't been able to get here, so let's then move on to Elvatrice Belsches.
Good morning, everyone. As an educator, I like to start with a question. When was the last time you heard a public history lecture on the free Black experience in Richmond or Virginia? Just by a show of hands. Okay. And? Yes. Thank you. I created that particular lecture, Making a Place for Themselves, a survey of the free Black experience in both Richmond and Petersburg, because I realized that there was a dearth as it relates to that very important topic. We tend to hear a lot more about the massive slave trade here, correct? However, the free Black experience is one of the most powerful stories less told. And I'd like to summarize and lead you to some topics that I hope you'll ask about with the short time that I have with this intro. Starting things out with 1619. One of the biggest questions that is very complex, and there's no easy answer, is, were the first people who came on that boat, the 20 and some odd, were they indentured servants or were they enslaved? I'm not going to address that off the top, but it's subject to discussion. Secondly, how did people become free? It may surprise you that in 1860, the city that in Virginia that had the highest free Black population was Petersburg, with about 3,200 people. And we in Richmond were second, with about 2,600. So we have to talk about how people became free, and I'll give you some of those pathways off the top. First of all, there were some, of course, that were indentured servants, and after they did their time, of course, they were free and to serve who they pleased. Secondly, we need to talk about avenues such as last wills and testaments, acts of the legislature, particularly sometimes for meritorious service, manumissions, and by manumissions we simply mean granting someone freedom. Self-emancipation, what do you think we mean by that? you ran away, right? You simply ran away. Next, also, in addition to the things we just talked about, we have to talk about status. And we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the laws that ruled over the free and enslaved. With the laws, particularly at around 1662 or so, it was really solidified in terms of who was free or who was able to claim freedom and those who were not. With that, we cannot predicate the fact that slavery began officially there because in custom it had already started, okay? Having said that, we've talked about last will and testaments, manumissions, we've talked about acts of the legislature, we've talked about self-emancipation, but in talking about those laws, and I need to mention too, there were some black men, of course, who were liberated because of their service in the War of 1812 and also in the Revolutionary War. Quite a few gentlemen out of Lancaster and Northumberland County were able to garner their freedom that way. Also, let's talk about the preponderance of free people or how they became free. The majority fall within 5 areas, and I bring this from you from the work of Dr. Luther Porter Jackson. There are some seminal works. I'd like to talk about those off the top. His is one of those, and also Ira Berlin's Slaves Without Masters, as well as the work of John T. O'Brien, particularly The Free Negro in Virginia by John H. Russell, 1913 or so. But going back to the main areas or main topics or ways that people were able to claim freedom. Number one, it came down after 1662, particularly with that matrilineal line. Your status was predicated on what your mom's status was. Okay? If your mom was free, it didn't matter if your father was white or free, it came down to the status of your mother usually. There are exceptions to everything. So oftentimes kids were free if their parents were free, or if their mom or mothers were free. Offspring of white mothers and black fathers were also given free status, although they were oftentimes relegated to serving apprenticeships up to the age of 31 years old. That was brought back down a little later to the early 20s, but it wasn't gravy because you were free. We'll talk about some challenges to free people. If you could prove your Native American heritage and your dad was free or mom was Native American, oftentimes we know by court records, and many of them are here at the Library of Virginia, that people would sue for their freedom in court and actually prove it through genealogy. I am of the Pamunkey tribe, and so on and so forth. So those are just some of the main ways in terms of, again, watching for that matrilineal line, and at the same time, there are exceptions to everything, but those are some of the main ways that people became free or were classified as free, if you will. We'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the role of Virginia's black codes on the people who were free, as well as the religious experience, their experience with literacy, some of the major families. So I hope you will ask about those so that we can talk about those during the Q&A portion, because there are powerful stories that will come out of it, out of this, particularly with the quest for literacy. And also the role of fraternal organizations. We had here as early as 1815, the Burying Ground Society of the Free People of Color of the city of Richmond. I know that's a mouthful, but that was 1850, and there are extant pages to their ledger. And I can tell you, audience, that, and looking at the minutes from 1845, these men and women were very literate, so much so that they followed Robert's Rules of Order. So these are things you don't hear a lot about, but I want to be able to share with you in the time that we have left. And I think I'll probably stop there, but I hope to talk about the things that we just mentioned briefly when we return back around, I guess, for Q&A. Thank you so much, and I yield back my time. Okay.
I understand Ms. Bingham was having some trouble getting into the building. Are you here? Okay. So, All right. Well, I think then the reorganization would be now for us to sit and begin to take your questions and comments as we have together a conversation. Please come up. And with Dr. Egerton also with us. Are you with us still, Professor?
Nope.
And when Ms. Bingham arrives, then we'll hear from her and continue the conversation. Yes? Good.
Or is it okay if we pick up where we left off? All right. Let's talk about the laws, because they were very impactful as it relates to free blacks. As we meander through the 1600s to the 1700s, you start to see laws that are more and more exclusionary, and they culminated in the 1660s of really codifying what slavery was. Now, again, it's still a challenging and complex question, and therefore answer about some of the earliest people. There were people who came over on that headright system and worked 3, 5, or 7 years and were free. Okay? So we hear a lot more about the 20 and odd, but there's evidence that there were people here prior to that 1619 August, I should say, date. Having said that, there was some difficulty in determining or classifying people who were listed as mulatto, which usually meant biracial, but in actuality, they used that for people who were light-skinned also. Having said that, what was the status of someone whose mom was enslaved and their dad was as a slave owner? Well, that law finally had to be, well, I should say the law came about hopefully to bring clarification to that in around 1662. After that, we see more and more laws that became more and more stringent as it relates to free people of color. Finally, in around 1793, a law was enacted that required that you be registered in your locales. And those are really the mother lode for those of us who do research, because it gives you county by county and city by city, for the most part, lots of information, particularly with families, and sometimes it gives you information regarding who owns you last. But having said that, I want to give you at least a couple of books that are pertinent if you want to do further research as relative to the laws. June Purcell Gill's book, I think it's Black Slave Codes within or summaries in the Virginia legislature. That's a really concise read, and you can go straight to the years for that. Having said that, it is actually very apparent, audience, that people became fearful after insurrections. So you can imagine that after the Gabriel insurrection and a couple of insurrections in Tidewater, 1801, 1802, you start to see more and more laws that were more and more restrictive, as it relates to free blacks. Having said that, we had around 1806, if you will, the law that said if you were freed after, I think it may have been May 1st of that year, you had 1 year to get out of the Old Dominion. Was that reinforced very much? No, but it still put fear in people, and people could actually skirt that through petitioning the legislature, and those records are also here under the legislative petitions, if you will. Having said that, again, with the Denmark Vesey affair, 1822, you start to see more and more reactionary laws, and they became more and more strict as it relates to free blacks being able to acquire other blacks. Now, it's a known fact that free blacks also owned enslaved people, but primarily it's important to know that most of it was out of benevolence, and many of them, or the majority of them, were kin people. Okay? Not all of them, but the majority of them. But the laws became so restrictive, everyone, as we moved towards 1850, that it said you could only acquire other people by descent. Was it enforced very well? The answer is no. We can talk about also the American Colonization Society, where free people welcomed in their locales, or even in Richmond. The answer is no, not always. And having said that, and I want to make sure we have time to, yes. Yeah, all right. Also, the role of the church cannot be understated. The first Baptist church here was founded in 1780, the First Baptist Meeting House, and it was integrated. In short order, blacks outnumbered the whites almost 4-to-1 at that church, and it actually stood, good morning.
Good morning.
It stood at about 14th and Broad Street, or 14th and College. Having said that, in 1841, that church split, and that is how we got First African Baptist Church. But I want to speak to self-determination even in that arena. Why? Because the blacks were not able, the black congregants weren't able to be attended to as they should have been because of the sheer numbers. So in 1823, everyone, they petitioned the legislature, and we have that extant list of nearly 100 free blacks who said, we want to start an African church. That's a powerful example of self-determination. And every single one of them is listed. The majority of them were free, and the highest people in the city backed them up. But they were able to get that church. So we had at least, or Richmond had at least 6 churches, black churches, that were founded prior to the Civil War. I'll come back because I don't want to go on too long to please ask about the quest for literacy. And I'll yield back my time.
Thank you, Ms. Belsches. So hold on to those ideas and that information. Think about what else you want to know or say about these facts that are stirring in the room. And now we'd like to hear from Ms. Bingham, 5 or 10 minutes. So,
Sure. Oh, that's right, I do have a mic. Hi, I didn't understand about the parade. I have been here for 30 minutes. My name is Pamela Bingham. I am originally from Jackson, Mississippi, and for purposes of this discussion, my ancestor came through Richmond, as many of our ancestors did, and my parents relocated here in 1984 to Petersburg, which was a really exciting experience for my father because he is our family historian. To conserve time, I'm going to kind of read, and then I want to address how you keep legacy alive and the importance of Shockoe Bottom and what happens in Richmond. So our Bingham story, I am the daughter of Drs. Haskell S. Bingham and Robbie Barnes Bingham. I am the granddaughter of Reverend Judge Robert Bingham and Julia Edmonds Bingham. I am the great-granddaughter of George Washington Bingham, the great-great-granddaughter of Samuel Joshua Bingham, who is the son of Gabriel. And I'm a show and tell Girl Scout person. So I brought some props, but I wanted to show you an iteration. Yes. Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, that'll be fine. Thank you for the suggestion. I can work anywhere because I'm a consultant. So I'm usually in a corner. Somebody else's laptop is up here. Do we have any young people? No. I don't want to connect. Do we have any young people that can come up here and hold this for me? Seriously. 2 volunteers? Sure. You're young. And I do have a cane. So if you'll step across the front. Thank you. So, yeah, you're going to have to step across the front. So first, giving honor to the elders in the room, and I know my 5 minutes is fleeing. So our Bingham story is that my grandfather tagged my father to be the family historian in his teens. They traveled from Mississippi. They listened to stories. This would have been segregated Mississippi, 43 or so. People would bring their Bibles and their family information written on grocery bags, and Daddy would write it down for his father, who is a minister and founder of our family church. He also founded the Republican Party, Lincoln Republicans of Warren County, Mississippi, and the NAACP, for which he was spied upon by the Mississippi state government in the Sovereignty Commission files. They pretty much spied on all of my aunts and uncles because they were educators, and education is revolutionary. So Daddy went to Jackson State College. He was student body president twice, and while there, he and President Jacob L. Reddix traveled to the southern part of Africa, Zimbabwe, then Rhodesia, and the Natal province. Because of the stories that he had been told by his uncles and his father, he was able to meet with a historian there. And there is a book coming out, so I'm not going to give all the details. But they connected to a griot, and that's how we learned our ancestors' story. So sort of like roots, not exactly. You know, the joy for me is that in going to the Smithsonian Museum, the slave ship that my dad found was called the Greyhound. As of the 4 times I've now been to the museum, I've found four mentionings of Greyhound, and our date is actually different. So I'm going to be meeting with the Smithsonian historian to see if we can figure out why our date is different. But it was a joy and a painful joy to see the ship's name on the wall. I recently read in the Free Press that the residents of Africatown in Alabama have found their slave ship, the Clotilda, which is phenomenal. And they're trying to meet with the ship's owners, this family that's really wealthy that's still there, and they're not trying to meet with them. So that should not be surprising. So let me fast forward to our Gabriel work. But let me just tell you this. People all over the world are interested in this experience. Last month, I was at the South African Embassy. I actually had not been there in a long time. I used to protest there in the 80s. And I was very moved by a professor who said to me, "We know that some of our family are lost. How do we find them?" So this was a totally different context of the story. You know, we're always focused on the African-American side, but there are people on the continent who are trying to find their family too. And so now, you know, I have some concerns about some of the DNA businesses. However, I have now been to Belize last summer with my Girl Scouts. People there are interested. I have friends in the Caribbean. I'm being approached by Binghams in Jamaica. Bingham is a British name, so we may or may not be related. But there's a worldwide connection. And Dr. Blakey would know more about the DNA, but after talking to Dr. Gina Page of African Ancestry, we have like mutual friends in DC, and knowing how much of the human genome is now being mapped, it's just an interesting concept for me as an engineer and a scientist in terms of where we can go with this. Richmond needs to be the go-to location for the Richmond slave trade for people of the African diaspora. We are already late. Apparently, South Carolina has hooked up with the Church of Latter-day Saints and are building like $1 million family research facility down there. We are late. And we have got to, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We just have to embrace it all, and this is the beginning. So in summary, do you want me to talk about what the Binghams have done? Do I have time? Okay. So I'm going to like really race through this, and I apologize. The Bingham family based our foundation on oral history. You haven't even known me that long, but you can probably tell we're a family of talkers. And we're from a Southern Baptist orientation, so we really talk. In our family, after church, we would visit our elders. I didn't understand it. Uncle Tommy, who's actually my great uncle, my grandfather's brother, was just a nice older man to me. And he told stories, and he told stories, and he told stories. My dad was preparing us for this work, the work he had done. So when people ask me, what do you do in your family, the first thing you have to do is talk to your oldest family members. It's really not rocket science in that perspective. And sometimes that comes with a lot of pain and unpacking a lot of baggage. There were a lot of secrets that came out of my dad's research. They're still coming out. I said, who is this Aunt Harriet? That's Papa's other child. Oh. I've never met her. So I've traveled with my dad. He's traveled everywhere. I've been to places like Red Lick, Mississippi, even San Diego, because wherever I travel for work, he would say, oh, we have a cousin there. San Diego, Chicago, New Orleans, Dallas, Houston, Alaska. So there were phone calls before there were bulk rates. My dad's phone bill was like $300 or $400. There have been family historians in different branches of the family. They keep funeral programs. They attend funerals. They have churches. These are all documents, Bibles, cemeteries, courthouses. So we have used all that, Freedmen Bureau records, which for some reason are being managed by the Church of Latter-day Saints. We can talk about that later. Somebody can explain that to me. So we started having family reunions because we got tired of meeting family at funerals. And they started in 1981. Little things, a children's history quiz, which my nephew Jonathan probably mastered when he was 8. Gabriel's Rebellion. This is a play we do at every reunion. My father wrote it with my sister overseeing it. We do pieces of it, if not the whole play. Ancestral Voices. Dad has turned people's individual testimonies into vignettes. I am Gabriel. I am Stephen. I am Robert. I am Haskell. I am Pamela. And we perform these vignettes from the beginning of the tree down so that the family understands. T-shirts, art. You underestimate the value of T-shirts in art, but graphic design is very important. The family tree is a work in progress, and I'd like to thank my friend Michelle Darden-Lee of Mingus Communications who helped me with this, because this is not all in chronological order, but I'll give you, and this is not everyone, we actually have 4,000 names. I was so impressed at the Arthur Ashe family tree. That is what I now aspire to do before I pass. So beginning with our ancestor from the Natal province of South Africa who married Easter, these were their children. Gabriel comes from the Stephen and Jenny block. I think you all know the story that Gabriel's father, Stephen, was hung for trying to organize. He was a New Light preacher. My part of the tree, Martin, Rachel, Solomon, Gabriel. Samuel Joshua was a breeder slave. This part is very painful for me. Breeder slaves were made to breed, like horses, cattle. So our ancestor is alleged to have had 100 offspring in 12 states. These are the names that my grandfather and great-grandfather were able to provide. So my dad's part of the tree, Samuel Joshua, comes from George Washington Bingham, who actually helped at Vicksburg. You know, somebody had to help Grant at Vicksburg. And my dad fought for most of his life to get him recognized. The battlefield at Vicksburg did finally recognize that a slave assisted, but they've never acknowledged that it was our great-grandfather. George Washington, I am part of his third family. He was busy. And his wife's name was Charlotte. So my grandmother Charlotte, this is where my dad's father comes in, Joseph Robert. And Uncle Tommy is the one who told me all the stories. He was the baby. From Judge Robert comes my dad's line of 14. And he is Haskell. From Haskell come Pamela and Gail. So it's very difficult to get this level of detail for African American families because you're not able to start. And it also is amazing to me that people seem to forget we were treated as property until the Civil War. So we're not listed on plantation records and court records as people. We're listed as property and sometimes unnamed. Several people have now seen the PBS sort of history detective shows and genealogy shows, so you may have a better sense of that. But I met a gentleman in Hopewell who can trace his family 4,000 years to Greece, and he did not recognize that I cannot do that. It was not even a part of his consciousness, and I said, do you know how many people would want to trace their families 4,000 years? So Richmond has a unique opportunity. We cannot squander it. So much happened here. We have to acknowledge it. We have to respect it. We have to tell the truth about it. And we have to document it, and not document it in a way that celebrates the lost cause. I'm in Petersburg. There is a lot of celebration of the lost cause in Petersburg. But we have to document it in a way that's true. I was watching the Skip Gates program one night, working late, about midnight. I don't think I emailed you. But in closing, Sean Puffy Combs found out that he had an ancestor who fought in the Battle of the Crater. Did y'all know that? So I just said, okay, that's interesting. We need to reach out because I'm supporting Superintendent Rogers at the battlefield and trying to get more of the U.S. colored troops story out there. There's so much that can be gained by this work. I don't think any of it is about guilting people, but it's acknowledgement. We have to acknowledge truth. There's been so much whitewashing over centuries and centuries. And here, 400 years later, and I'll close with this, I am encouraged by two things, young people, but we have to teach them. I was at the credit union yesterday at Virginia State, and a woman said her daughter is reading A Handmaid's Tale, and she was very disturbed by it, as she should be. But she did not make the connection that this was the experience of African-American women in slavery. She said, oh, this is horrible, we can't let this happen. Well, it's already happened. So that's story one. The second story that brings me tremendous joy to share with you today is there is a wonderful website on Gabriel's Rebellion done by a young lady in Texas, and I will provide that in the follow-up. Her name is Kristen De La Garza. She's from San Antonio, Texas. I Googled this girl. I hunted her down. This website is so impressive. She won one of these History Day competitions in Texas. And then she went to nationals, in which they present in D.C., Maryland. And she did this really great presentation on Gabriel, and I said, how do you even know of this story? And she told me about a teacher. Thank God for teachers who tell the truth. And she is now at Yale. She is studying the mapping of the adolescent brain. We didn't get her in history, but she's still very interested in the story, and we will be friends for life. She did this when she was 15. So communicating with her via LinkedIn and finding her on Google brought me so much joy. I also want to thank Dr. Autumn Barrett, who's not here. She did a 6-hour interview with my dad, who would not allow her to video. He would not allow her to video or record it. So she took 6 hours of written notes. And that's the kind of work it takes to get to this. 50 years, hundreds of conversations, thousands of conversations, thousands of family sheets, thousands of funeral programs. So that's my quick summary.
Thank you, Ms. Bingham. So we have a lot to work with.
Thank you all.
So we have 15 minutes for discussion. Please do join in.
Since there are no hands, may I give you a quick?
Well, let's do a chat.
Oh, okay.
Yes, sir. Sorry, I saw his hand. Is your hand up? Okay, yes, sir. Is there a mic that can go around? Can someone take a mic? Or you can come to the mic. Or you come, okay. Set up where you can come get a mic. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here and helping us get through our brotherhood. I have a question directed to Dr. Blakely.
Blakey.
But it involves literacy, and it involves religion. And as we look at what we're trying to discover in our humanness is the oppression that is applied to us individually and as groups. And the freedom we speak of in the laws is for our physical freedom, but our intellectual freedom is something that we personally have. And I have a question on how do we reconcile our intellectual freedom and our physical freedom within our search for our history? That's my question.
So to be able to discuss any reconciliation, I need to know what the contradiction or the conflict is. So what is the conflict that you see between personal, intellectual and personal freedom or physical freedom?
I direct my question to you as an agnostic because oppression comes from literacy that's been denied. And freedom comes from education. And so there's a conflict of interest between denying literacy through religious. I grew up a Catholic, and so we can't divide our faith amongst as diverse a group of religions as there are available to us. And as an agnostic, I have to imagine you're looking at it from a universal perspective. And so if, as it is stated in the Bible I read, that we can't eat from a thing called the tree of knowledge, which gives us literacy and denies us literacy, as an agnostic, I see there's an independence in your potential thinking as it relates to our humanness, which is what we're trying to discover and protect as we go to the main topic.
I think I understand. But, and my answer is in a particularly critical sort of vein. And I'll just say that I've just about finished a book that I'm talking to a publisher about now. It's about 1,000 pages on race and racism in science and society. Our problem, the problem you're referring to, is, I think, how ideology, belief, often beliefs in a kind of mythology or or assumptions for which there is no evidence. Maybe it's common sense, maybe it's a religion, maybe it's white supremacy, come to cloud our understanding of the problem we face, the problems we face, problems of inequity. There's massive disguise of American inequity that people assume to be the truth, but that is simply a disguise, hopeful, wishful thinking, as it were. I won't go into the examples, they're pressing on me. Tell. But as an agnostic, or perhaps others like Stephen Jay Gould, who was Jewish, but he may have been a secular Jew, science does not provide the universal truth either. And the notion of neutrality, Frederick Douglass in 1854, I think, exposed very well at the beginning of as he began the nature-nurture debate with physical anthropology, craniometricians. Says no other group of people presumes to have a neutral point of view. Why? And they were trying to support slavery with their biological determinism. He says, so you are either for us or you're against us. I think that it remains a truth that science is based on the, I think of it as objectivity 1 and 2. Number 1 is objectivity that is to understand the world in terms of evidence, the object, material evidence. That is science. But the notion that our interpretations of that evidence, which is what gives the evidence all of its meaning, is somehow neutral, has absolutely no basis, nor can it be found to have a basis, that any truth would exist throughout all time and space. We don't have the way of observing that, that is objectivity number one, to apply to that notion that we obtain universal truth. And as I see it in this, as I've looked over this history, it has much to do, these definitions of neutrality of science give it authority, but it is an authority in the European Enlightenment that is a part of the definition of whiteness. And it is part of the authority that white people presume to have to, and it comes also from Christianity, to have the ultimate truth, as if to say, we know what they think, but we know. So I think the more critical thing is to expose, for example, the deep subjectivity of whiteness. There's the idea that whites are objective. It's nothing of, whites are deeply subjective, but they are portrayed as a normative, universal thing. This also comes out of all that history, and it's not true. So we need to get up under the, and be critical of ideology where it exists everywhere in order, I agree, to get to greater fact, critical fact about all those things around our lives, the inequities of class, the inequities of race, racism, the inequities of patriarchy, and in order to fight them. But it's not about religion or science. And it's, okay. All right, so it's not about, I'm not going to make Gnosticism the new Catholicism. That's my point. Okay, that's all I saw. But I think I've talked enough. Can we go to there was someone else? No?
Yeah, sure. I just want to thank you for that because my whole concern was we're human. Mm-hmm. We're not scientists. We're not religious. We're human. And when you spoke of human, is what I was trying to rationalize inside myself, because I lived 13 years in Mississippi as well. And it was only until and coming from Boston area, I knew things as ethnic, not racial. And so I was hoping that we would be able to get beyond what I was told in Mississippi was that I wasn't white enough.
Okay,
So,
all right,
thank you very much.
Sir, are you, yes, sir.
I'm in line here next. My name is Steve Atkinson, and I was just going to ask the folks here who've come, and well, before I do ask this question, I'd like to thank the moderators, Dr. Blakey, and I need to learn y'all's names and get to interface with you and get to know you better. I would like a showing of hands here now. Does the name James from the Revolutionary War mean anything to anyone here? Please raise your hand if the word James from the Revolutionary War.
You're being asked, do you mean James Lafayette?
Yes. Lafayette is the name that he took.
There are a number of Jameses.
Marquis
They
de
wanted to be
Lafayette.
sure that they understand who you're referring
Yes,
to.
good question. A show of hands. Okay, I would say that would be 2% of the folks here. James was a slave for the Armistead family. During the Revolutionary War, he was recruited by Marquis de Lafayette to spy on General Cornwallis. He was an integral part of the winning of the Revolutionary War due to the fact that he provided information regarding I have been told that I have limited time here now. If anyone would like to speak with me afterwards regarding James, I would appreciate it. I'm a past program administrator for the Revolutionary War, Commonwealth of Virginia, Revolutionary War Graves Preservation and Maintenance Program. From 2008 to 2012, I was involved in distributing money to qualified associations, $5 per grave per year. James is
Okay, I think we need to move on to the next comment, sir, if we may.
Yes.
And questions, hopefully. Please. Thank
The
you.
question is, I asked how many people know James here. I got 2% reaction.
Sir, thank you. So we've got 5 minutes, and technically, and so we're hoping for wouldn't be prohibitive of comments, but questions would be helpful. Yes, sir.
Anna came over here to give us a stamp of brevity this morning, so I'll do the best I can. I'm a hopeless politician all my life, and it's hard to be brief, but I think I just died and went to heaven this morning that this event has finally come. Yeah. I've been jumping up and down about how important it is that we have a truth and reconciliation process. A truth and reconciliation process that can be ongoing, that even can be live streamed so people can engage in it around the world. I'd like your thoughts about such an enterprise as we build up this Shockoe Bottom as an enterprise.
Okay, thank you. Was there something? We do have another question, though, so could you follow this gentleman? Let's take all the questions now and see how we can respond. Yes, sir.
Hi, I do waste management and community groundkeeping in Shockoe Bottom, specifically around the 17th Market, and I do it 6-7 days a week. And I can tell everybody in this room, literally, when I do my thing, picking up the trash after the humans, I can see the blood on the ground. I see it. It's almost like a spooky spiritual thing, and I think you guys know what blood I'm talking about. Okay, and I see it every day. And I would say my question to you guys is that, is there a balance between capitalism and showing history? Because that's what's going on in Shockoe Bottom. The business guys, they want some parking spaces, man. They got these kids from VCU making apartments. They got to make space for them. And so our history is a balance. And so is there a balance? I see DC does it, tourist places do it, can Richmond do it? And my final thing I want to say is I do a lot of tourists come down and people talk, and I say to them, they ask me what's going on. There's not enough signage down here telling people what's going on. Miss Lumpkin, there should be a sign about Miss Lumpkin somewhere down here.
Thank you.
Thank
so
you.
Let's take these last two questions and whatever you can respond to from this DS, please do.
With the breadth and depth of the people attending this event today, the panelists and the panelists to come, how do we move? Okay, with the breadth and depth of the panelists today, how do we move this from being an elite conversation to the masses?
Thank you. And our last comment or question.
Good morning. My question is for Ms. Bingham. Very simply, I was very curious to know, have you always known your family history connection to Gabriel, or was that something you had to research and rediscover?
So actually, this is the way it's done in African universities. They don't take one question at a time. They'll take the series of questions and then one response to those that one chooses to respond to. So we're doing it the African way today. So please do respond to what you.
Okay. I'd like to respond to the one about the ability to bring this to the masses. My mantra is this, and I try to live it. When you marry powerful storytelling with sound scholarship, it results in public history at its finest. And so we have a lot of highbrow stuff, but to get the masses, things like documentaries, things like conducting oral histories, and publications that are easy reads, I've found are very beneficial. Just one quick story, and you may have to bring the cane out, but I'm going to tell it. One of the most powerful stories that I share, because it's an uplifting thing for everyone, is this. The Ruffin family, who were free blacks, quickly. Mr. Ruffin, George Washington Ruffin, was born in 1800 here, and he was a free black barber. Black barbers did exceedingly well. He and his wife contracted itinerant teachers to teach their kids. We know about the laws, but nevertheless, black and white teachers would come from home to home. But once they arrived at probably limits of education, Mr. and Mrs. Ruffin, both of whom were born free, decided to undergo the ultimate sacrifice, everyone. They sent Mrs. Ruffin and the 8 kids up to Boston so that the kids would be able to attain a secondary education. Let's look at quickly what came out of that. The oldest son, George Lewis Ruffin, read the law. He matriculated at the schools in Boston, and he entered Harvard University's law school and graduated in record time. So our George Lewis Ruffin graduated from Harvard Law School in 1869, becoming the first known black graduate ever of Harvard University's law school. That's self-determination. It didn't stop there. He went on to become the first black to sit on city council in Boston, the first to serve in its legislature, and he even wrote the introduction to one of Frederick Douglass's additions to his autobiography. He also was appointed, by the way, by General Butler as the first known judge in all of New England. By the way, the first known black person to graduate from Yale University's law school was one of ours, Mr. Edwin Archer Randolph. That occurred in 1880. These are stories that talk of self-determination, and these are the things I think motivate people. When people can come out of the wake of freedom, or born in the wake of freedom, can come out of these things to found banks and become judges, anything is possible with faith and hard work and literacy. And I thank you, and I yield back my time.
Thank you. Ms. Bingham?
So I'll take was the former city council member's question and your question. History. You know, history, growing up, I am a beneficiary of the civil rights movement. So everyone around me was historic. James Meredith went to our church. I knew Mr. Meredith and his family. Alice Walker was our neighbor at one point. We knew her as Mrs. Leventhal. And Rebecca. And so because of the family I grew up in, on both my mother and my father's side, I've always been aware of history. My interest has been varied, as any one of my generation. We were told, be better, because a lot of sacrifice has been made for you. So we need you to be better and do everything you could do. There were books. I grew up around Jackson State University, a historically black college university. So there were people around me who wrote books. Lerone Bennett of Tougaloo actually brought my 1964 version of Before the Mayflower. Margaret Walker Alexander, who wrote Jubilee, which preceded Roots by, at least a decade, taught both my parents. She would write the most beautiful Christmas letters, which, are historic. So it's contextual. I don't think I learned about Gabriel. Maybe I learned about him with Howard Adams' Great Negroes Past and Present, which I used as a reference for all of my papers for many, many years. My dad really started telling the story when we moved here. And so when Michelle asked about making it available to the masses, our family is very diverse, like most African-American families. Everyone is not college educated. Some people are not high school educated. My grandfather had a third-grade education. But he made this a priority in terms of oral history. So I do think we can deliver this. It is part of the masses, and the way that we do it in our family reunion, we make sure it gets out. I have a cousin who just wrote a dissertation. I do workshops down in Petersburg at the library. There are ways to tell the story so that everyone knows as much about Gabriel as they do about Patrick Henry or Thomas Jefferson. We tell what we want to tell. We have a great oral history in the black tradition. I marvel at the quickness of gossip. This whole thing with Gabrielle Union, I hadn't been on social media for a couple of days, so I missed it. And then it was like people are telling me about it left and right. And, is this the most important thing going on in the world? I don't know. But we talk about what we want to talk about. We prioritize what we want to prioritize. Now, Mississippi at various phases has talked about a truth and reconciliation. I think that's going to be a ways off. But we got to at least get to the truth part. Let's start with getting to the truth part, and that's what I think Virginia has to do. Dr. Blakey, I just have to say this. I am so appreciative to Anna for organizing this because I was very much not satisfied with what we've done with American Evolution. I think it fell short. We had opportunity to do more. I know there were people on advisory committees, you know, former Governor Wilder, but it fell short. A lot of money was spent, and it fell short. So we just take the mantle from here, and we just do it.
Thank you. So I just want to say that in my view, American Revolution was the bureaucracies and the greater white public stealing the narrative. That this date, 1619, that had been an African-American symbol for so long, not only becomes also about women, and this is the diversity regime that contracts and moves away from all of the substantial rectification of the inequities of race, to women, to include white women, who actually came the year after, and not in 1619, and embraces now this counter-narrative, essentially, of free legislative society. It is to shift the narrative into their wishful thinking. And African Americans, and I watched what happened in Hampton Roads, maintained our focus and our celebration and our honor in the midst of all of this, and this is what we do. So, but I do want to say just one thing as we close about in response to the question about capitalism and basically the government bureaucracies, greed and expeditious approaches to heritage sites that defies humanity. This is what happened in New York 25 years ago. They wished to sweep away the African burial ground to build their building. The laws exist. The National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106, Section 110, archaeologists work with these all the time, are there for the public to take charge and contain those efforts, and in New York, turn them around completely, so democracy only works if you work it. And so I would recommend that. Anna, we're running now, we're very late. Please, take over.
Big hand, big hand. Thank you all, Pamela, Elvatrice, Michael, and Doug out there in the ether world. Thank you for being a part of the first panel. We are a little late into our break, and so we do have coffee and tea out there for you to enjoy, but we are going to come back here. What time is it? We're going to be here, we start at 11, so you got 5 minutes to go, do what you got to do, and come on back.